For 30 years, I knocked on God's door, asking, pleading, begging for answers. Then one morning, in complete exhaustion, I stopped knocking and discovered the door had never been closed. In fact, there was no door at all. What I'd been seeking outside myself had been waiting patiently within me all along, not as something I needed to receive, but as something I needed to recognize. We have been taught to believe that prayer is a transaction, that somewhere in the heavens sits a divine accountant, tallying our requests, weighing our worthiness, deciding who receives and who goes without. This morning I invite you to consider that everything you've been taught about asking and receiving may be the very thing standing between you and the answer you seek. The greatest mystery of the spiritual life is this: what if there is nothing to receive because there is nothing missing? Let that settle into your consciousness for a moment, not as a platitude, but as a living truth. What if the entire premise of lack, the foundation upon which all our asking is built, is itself the illusion that must be dissolved? You see, when the Master said, "Ask, and you shall receive," he was not teaching technique. He was not providing a formula for cosmic manipulation. He was revealing a principle so radical that 2,000 years later we're still trying to understand it, that the asking and the receiving are not separate events in time, but one movement of consciousness recognizing itself. Think about this deeply. When does a question truly arise in your mind? Only when some level of knowing is already present. The question, "How can I find peace?" cannot even formulate itself unless peace already exists somewhere in your consciousness. The seed of the answer lives within the asking itself. This is why the saints and mystics throughout history have spoken of prayer not as petition, but as recognition. Not as begging, but as beholding. Not as reaching outward, but as turning inward to discover what was never absent. But we have made it complicated. We have created elaborate systems of prayer, techniques of manifestation, methods of attraction, all based on the assumption that we are separate from our good, that God is separate from us, that heaven is somewhere else, and we are here, lacking, limited, locked out of the kingdom. And so we ask, we plead, we negotiate, we make promises. God, if you'll just give me this, I'll do that. As if the infinite needs our bargains, as if the source of all creation is waiting for us to say the right words, perform the right ritual, achieve the right state of worthiness. This is not spirituality. This is spiritual commerce. And it has nothing to do with the mystery Jesus was revealing. The true secret, the mystery within the mystery, is that we are not separate from God-seeking connection. We are God consciousness itself, temporarily believing in separation. The asking is not ours, it is God asking of itself. The receiving is not ours, it is God revealing itself to itself through us. When you understand this, prayer transforms completely. You are no longer a beggar at heaven's gate. You are the gate itself. You are the kingdom. You are the answer pretending for a moment to be the question. This is why Jesus could say, "Before they ask, I will answer." Because in the realm of consciousness, which is the only real realm, there is no before and after. There is no gap between desire and fulfillment. The moment the desire arises, it arises from fullness, not from lack. So how do we live this? How do we move from the constant asking, the anxiety, the grasping, the feeling of incompleteness, to the receiving that requires no asking? Not through more effort, not through better techniques, not through accumulating spiritual knowledge or practices, but through one simple radical act: stop, Stop the mental chatter. Stop the endless seeking. Stop trying to become something you're not. Stop reaching for a God outside yourself. Just stop. And in that stopping, in that silence, in that emptiness where all your strategies and efforts fall away, there you will find what you've been seeking, not as something new arriving, but as something eternal revealing itself. The mystery is not that God answers prayer. The mystery is that God is the prayer, the one praying, and the answer all, simultaneously present in your own consciousness, waiting only for the noise to cease, so it can be recognized. You don't need to become worthy to receive. You don't need to perfect your technique, master your thoughts, or achieve some elevated state. You need only to recognize what is already true, that you stand now and have always stood in the presence of infinite completeness. The asking ceases when you realize you already have. The seeking ends when you discover you already are. The mystery unlocks when you understand that the lock was never real, only your belief in it. So today, I invite you not to ask better or more powerfully, but to rest in the radical truth that underneath all your questions lives an answer that has never been absent, waiting only for your recognition. Be still, be aware, be receptive to what already is. This is the mystery unlocked. You are not seeking God. God is seeking to reveal itself as you. The silence beyond words. True prayer is not petition, but recognition of what already exists in spiritual consciousness. The act of asking dissolves when we understand we're not begging an external deity, but awakening to inner completeness. We have been conditioned to believe that prayer is conversation, that somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond the stars, beyond the veil of material sense, there exists a listener who awaits our words. And so we fill the silence with petitions. We construct elaborate sentences, beautiful phrases, eloquent requests. We believe that if we can only find the right words, the perfect combination of supplication and gratitude, we will finally be heard. But what if I told you that this entire approach, this verbal reaching outward, is the very thing that keeps us from the experience we seek? True prayer begins where words end. It begins in that vast, luminous silence where the personal self, with all its wants and needs and strategies, finally exhausts itself and falls quiet. In that quietness, something extraordinary happens, not something new arriving from outside, but something eternal revealing itself from within. You see, when we pray with words, we are operating from a fundamental assumption that we are separate from God, that God is over there and we are over here, that there is a distance to be bridged, a gap to be closed through the right combination of asking and faith. This assumption, this belief in separation, is the only real barrier between us and the awareness of divine presence. The great mystics understood this. They spoke of contemplative prayer, of silent communion, of resting in God rather than reaching for God. They discovered through direct experience that the moment the mind becomes still, the moment personal desire ceases its clamoring, the moment we stop trying to inform the infinite of what we think we need in that moment, we become aware of a presence that was always there, waiting beneath the noise of our thinking. This is not the silence of suppression. It is not about forcing thoughts away or creating a blank emptiness through sheer willpower. This is the silence of recognition, a gentle letting go of the belief that we must do something, become something, achieve something before we can experience the fullness of divine life. Think about it this way. When you are standing in a room filled with beautiful music, you don't need to ask to hear it. You need only to stop talking, stop the mental commentary, stop the internal dialogue long enough to become aware of what is already present. The music doesn't come because you asked. It was always there. Your silence simply allows you to perceive it. So it is with spiritual consciousness. God is not waiting for our words. God is not listening for the perfect prayer. God, the infinite, omnipresent intelligence that some call spirit, some call life, some call the Tao, is already completely present, fully expressing, totally available. Not as something external to us, but as the very consciousness through which we live and move and have our being. When we pray with words, we are often praying from the level of human need, from lack, from limitation, from the sense that something is missing and must be supplied. We are operating within the framework of the problem. And the strange truth is this: you cannot solve a problem from the level of consciousness that created it. But in silence, in that deep, receptive stillness where personal desire releases its grip, something shifts. We move from the consciousness of separation to the consciousness of wholeness. We move from the belief in lack to the recognition of completeness. We move from being a person seeking God to being consciousness itself, aware of its own divine nature. This is why the Master could sit in meditation for hours without speaking a word. This is why the ancient teachers would often respond to questions with silence rather than answers. They understood that words point toward truth, but silence embodies it. Words can describe the ocean, but only silence allows you to become the ocean. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that verbal prayer is wrong, or that speaking to God is invalid. There are moments when the heart overflows and words pour forth naturally, and that too is prayer. But these words, when they come from true prayer consciousness, are not petitions. They are recognitions. They are not asking for what we lack, but acknowledging what already is. The deeper mystery here is that authentic prayer is not about changing God's mind or informing the infinite of our situation. Prayer is about changing our own consciousness, about shifting from the belief in separation and lack to the awareness of union and completeness. And that shift happens most profoundly not in the speaking, but in the listening, not in the asking, but in the receiving, not in the words, but in the silence beyond words. When you enter that silence, not as a technique to get something, but as a sacred recognition of what already is, you discover something remarkable. You are not praying to God. You are the presence of God, becoming aware of itself. The prayer and the one praying and the one being prayed to are all one movement of divine consciousness, recognizing its own eternal presence. This is the silence that transforms. This is the wordless communion that heals. This is the prayer beyond petition that the mystics have always known, where asking dissolves into receiving because there was never any separation to begin with. Receptivity as spiritual law. Receiving isn't about manipulation or technique, but cultivating an inner stillness where divine wisdom can make itself known. The mystery lies in our capacity to be transparent to truth. There exists a principle in the universe as reliable as gravity, as constant as the rising sun, as unchangeable as mathematics. It is not a law that rewards some and punishes others. It is not a force that plays favorites or responds to manipulation. It is simply this: consciousness attuned to truth receives truth. Consciousness open to wholeness experiences wholeness. Consciousness transparent to the divine becomes aware of divinity. This is receptivity as spiritual law, and it operates with absolute precision whether we understand it or not. But we must be clear about what receptivity truly means, because the word has been so misunderstood, so distorted by the metaphysical marketplace that promises results through positive thinking and mental gymnastics. Receptivity is not a technique you perform. It is not a mental state you manufacture through affirmations or visualizations. It is not about making yourself a better receiver so that God can. Finally, pour blessings into your cup. True receptivity is the dissolving of the barrier between you and the awareness of what already exists. It is the transparency of consciousness that allows truth to be truth, light to be light, love to be love, without the interference of personal desire, fear, or expectation. Imagine a perfectly clear window. It doesn't do anything to the light that passes through it. It doesn't add to the light or subtract from it. It doesn't try to improve the light or shape it according to its preferences. It simply allows the light to be what it is, to reveal what it reveals, to illuminate what it illuminates. The window's only function is transparency. This is receptivity in its purest form, not an active grasping but a willing transparency. Not an effort to receive, but a removal of the obstacles to receiving. Not a doing, but an allowing. And what are these obstacles? They are the constructions of the human mind. Our judgments about what should be, our fears about what might not be, our demands about how things must appear, our insistence that God operate according to our timetable and our understanding. Every time we approach prayer with a predetermined outcome, we have closed ourselves to receptivity. Every time we say, God, I need this specific thing in this specific way, we have blocked the very channel through which divine wisdom seeks to express itself. This is the great paradox of spiritual life. The more specific our demands, the less receptive we become. The more we insist on our way, the less space we create for a wisdom infinitely greater than our own to operate. We are like a person standing before the ocean with a teaspoon, demanding that the ocean fit itself into our tiny container, never realizing that we ourselves could dissolve into the ocean's vastness. Receptivity requires a kind of spiritual humility that our culture rarely teaches. It requires the willingness to say, I don't know what I really need. I don't know what would truly serve the highest good. I don't know the answers to the questions I'm asking. And in that confession of not knowing, in that surrender of our limited perspective, something miraculous becomes possible. Divine intelligence, which does know, which sees the whole when we see only the part, which comprehends the pattern when we see only the fragment, can begin to work through us and as us. This is why the mystics spoke of emptiness as the prerequisite for fullness. Not because God requires us to be diminished, but because as long as our consciousness is filled with our own ideas, our own fears, our own demands, there is no room for anything greater to enter. The cup must be emptied before it can be filled. The soil must be cleared before the seed can grow. The consciousness must be stilled before the still small voice can be heard. But here's what makes this so challenging. For most of us, we live in a world that worships control. We have been taught that success comes through manipulation, through forcing outcomes, through making things happen, through sheer willpower. And we bring this same mentality to our spiritual life. We want to control God, control the universe, control outcomes. We want guarantees and formulas and techniques that work every time. Receptivity asks something entirely different of us. It asks us to release control, to trust in an intelligence we cannot see, to have faith in an order we cannot comprehend, to be willing to receive not what we think we want, but what infinite wisdom knows we need. This doesn't mean becoming passive or resigned. True receptivity is actually a highly active state, not the activity of doing, but the activity of awareness. It is alert, attentive, awake. It is listening with every fiber of being. It is watching for the movement of truth in consciousness. It is sensitive to the whisper of divine guidance that comes not in the thunder, but in the stillness. When you cultivate this quality of receptivity, something shifts in your entire relationship with life. You are no longer fighting against the universe, trying to bend it to your will. You are not struggling to make things happen through mental force. You are not anxious about whether your prayers will be answered. Instead, you become a clear channel through which divine purpose flows. You become transparent to truth. You become available to grace. And in that availability, you discover the deepest mystery of all, that what you've been trying so desperately to receive has been trying equally desperately to give itself to you. Not as something coming from outside, but as something emerging from the very center of your own being, waiting only for your receptivity to allow it into manifestation. The illusion of separation, the gap between asking and receiving, exists only in human consciousness. In spiritual reality, the question and answer are one. The seeking itself reveals the presence of what is sought. We live our entire lives believing in a gap. There is here where we stand in our limitation and need, and there is there where God exists in fullness and supply. There is now where we ask in our desperation or hope, and there is later when perhaps, if we've prayed correctly, believed sufficiently, been worthy enough, we will receive. The entire architecture of human consciousness is built upon this perceived separation between the asker and the answerer, between desire and fulfillment, between question and response. But what if this gap exists nowhere except in belief? What if the distance we think we must traverse is itself the illusion that keeps us wandering in the wilderness? Consider this carefully. In the realm of spiritual reality, which is the only reality that truly is, there is no separation between God and creation, between source and expression, between cause and effect. There is only one infinite, indivisible consciousness expressing itself as all that is. When you understand this, not intellectually but experientially, the entire concept of asking and receiving collapses into something far more profound. The question cannot exist without the answer already being present. Think about this in your own experience. When a genuine question arises in your mind, where does it come from? It emerges from somewhere deeper than your conscious thinking, doesn't it? There's a stirring, a movement, an impulse toward knowing, and that impulse itself, that desire to know, is already the presence of knowing seeking to reveal itself to you. You cannot hunger for bread unless you have tasted bread. You cannot thirst for water unless water is already part of your experience. And you cannot seek God unless God consciousness is already present within you, drawing you toward recognition of itself. The seeking is not yours alone. It is God seeking to know itself as you. The asking is not separate from God. It is God asking of itself through the vehicle of your consciousness. This is what the Master meant when he said the Father knows what you need before you ask. Not because there's an external deity observing you and cataloguing your requirements, but because the asking itself arises from the infinite intelligence that already contains all answers, all fulfillment, all completion. The question and the answer are two aspects of one movement of consciousness. When you ask for peace, peace is already present, or you wouldn't know what peace was, wouldn't recognize its absence, wouldn't be capable of formulating the desire for it. When you ask for wisdom, wisdom is already functioning in you, or you wouldn't be wise enough to know that you need wisdom. When you ask for love, love is already the foundation of your being, or you would have no capacity to conceive of love, no longing that points toward it. Do you see the radical nature of this truth? Every desire is evidence of the thing desired already existing in consciousness. Every question is proof that the answer is already present, waiting only to be recognized. The gap is not real. The separation is imaginary. What we call receiving is simply becoming aware of what already is, but human consciousness creates time, it creates sequence, it creates the experience of here and then there, now and then later, asking and then receiving. And in that creation of time, we experience what seems like separation, what feels like distance, what appears to be a journey from lack to fulfillment. This is not wrong, it's part of the human experience, but it's not the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is that in the mind of God, which is the only mind there is, all exists now, complete, whole, perfect, finished. There is no becoming, only being. There is no achieving, only recognizing. There is no receiving what was absent, only awakening to what was always present. This is why spiritual realization often comes in a flash, in an instant, in a moment of sudden recognition, not because something new arrived, but because the veil of separation suddenly dissolved and what was always true became visible. The mystics call this enlightenment, awakening, cosmic consciousness, that moment when the illusion of separation collapses and you see, beyond any doubt, that you and the Father are one, that seeking and finding are one, that asking and receiving are one. Now, I know this can sound abstract, theoretical, perhaps even irrelevant to the pressing needs of daily life. You may be thinking, that's all very mystical, but I have bills to pay, relationships that are struggling, health challenges that need addressing. How does this help me? And here's the practical power of understanding this principle. When you know that the gap is illusory, when you understand that the answer exists within the question itself, when you realize that what you seek is already seeking you from within your own consciousness, you stop the anxious, desperate reaching outward. You stop the manipulative techniques. You stop the bargaining and pleading. Instead, you turn within. You become still. You listen for what is already present. You allow the answer that exists in the depths of your own being to rise to the surface of awareness. You trust that the desire for healing contains healing, that the desire for provision contains provision, that the desire for love contains love. The gap between asking and receiving exists only in human consciousness that believes in separation. In spiritual reality, they are one. And the moment you recognize this, truly recognize it, not just as an idea but as a living experience, everything changes. Not because your circumstances instantly transform, but because you are no longer trapped in the consciousness of lack, no longer imprisoned by the belief in separation, no longer waiting for something outside yourself to complete you. You discover that what you've been asking for has been answering you all along, from the depths of your own being, waiting only for the illusion of separation to dissolve so you could finally see what was always true. Consciousness as source. We are not receiving from God, but recognizing God's presence as our own consciousness. The kingdom is within, not somewhere we must reach through supplication. We have been taught to look upward when we pray, to cast our eyes toward heaven, to send our thoughts beyond the clouds, to reach outward into the vast expanse of space, seeking a God who dwells somewhere out there, separate from us, watching us, judging us, deciding whether to grant or withhold what we request. This entire orientation, this looking outside ourselves for the source of our good, is the fundamental error that keeps us bound to limitation. The revolutionary truth that mystics have discovered throughout the ages is this: consciousness is cause, not a consciousness somewhere else, not a divine mind separated from your mind, but consciousness itself, Your consciousness, my consciousness, the one infinite consciousness appearing as all individual awareness, is the creative principle, the source, the substance, and the law of all manifestation. When Jesus said the kingdom of God is within you, he wasn't speaking poetically. He wasn't offering a comforting metaphor. He was stating a literal, demonstrable truth. Everything you have been seeking outside yourself exists as potential within your own consciousness, waiting only to be recognized and allowed into expression. This is not the same as the popular teaching that says you create your reality with your thoughts. That teaching, while containing a grain of truth, still operates from the assumption that you are a separate individual, manipulating external circumstances through mental power. What I'm speaking of goes far deeper than that. Your consciousness is not separate from God consciousness. It is not a little personal mind trying to communicate with a big cosmic mind. Your consciousness is God consciousness itself, individualized, expressing at this particular point in space and time as you. When you think, it is infinite intelligence thinking. When you love, it is infinite love loving. When you become aware, it is infinite awareness becoming aware of itself through you. This means that everything you need, everything you seek, everything that could possibly be required for your complete fulfillment already exists as potential within your own consciousness, not as something you must create, but as something you must allow, not as something you must achieve, but as something you must accept, not as something coming from outside, but as something emerging from within. Look at your own experience. Where does inspiration come from? You don't manufacture it through willpower. It arises spontaneously from depths you cannot measure. Where does love come from? You don't create it through effort. It wells up from a source beyond your personal control. Where does wisdom come from? You don't produce it through thinking harder. It reveals itself in moments of clarity that come from somewhere deeper than rational mind. All of this inspiration, love, wisdom, peace, joy, abundance flows from consciousness, not from your personal, limited, fear-based human consciousness, but from the infinite consciousness that is your true nature, your real identity, the ground of your being. This is why all the great spiritual teachers have pointed inward rather than outward. Know thyself, said the ancient Greeks. Look within, thou art the Buddha, taught the awakened ones. I and my Father are one, declared the Master. They were all pointing to the same recognition, that the source you seek is not external to you, but is the very consciousness through which you seek. But here's where it becomes practical, where this mystical truth meets the demands of daily living. If consciousness is source, then the transformation you seek does not come through changing external conditions. It comes through changing consciousness. It comes through shifting from the consciousness of separation and lack to the consciousness of unity and wholeness. It comes through releasing the beliefs, judgments, fears, and limitations that block the natural flow of divine good from within you. When you're experiencing lack, the lack is not in your bank account, it's in consciousness. When you're experiencing illness, the root is not in your body, it's in consciousness. When you're experiencing conflict, the source is not in other people, it's in consciousness. This doesn't mean these external conditions aren't real or important. It means they are effects, not causes. And you cannot permanently change effects by treating effects. You must go to cause. You must go to consciousness. This is radically different from the way most people approach prayer. Most prayer is an attempt to get God to change circumstances. God, change this situation. God, heal this body. God, bring me this supply. But if consciousness is source, then prayer is not about changing God's mind or convincing the universe to give you what you lack. Prayer is about changing your own consciousness, about releasing the beliefs in separation and limitation that block your awareness of the infinite good that already exists within you. When your consciousness shifts from fear to faith, from judgment to love, from resistance to acceptance, your entire experience shifts. Not because you've manipulated external reality, but because you've removed the internal obstacles that were blocking the natural expression of divine life through you. The good was always there. The abundance was always present. The healing was always available. Your consciousness simply wasn't transparent enough to allow it into visible manifestation. This is why the Master could say, "It is the Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom." The giving is not something that happens in the future when you become worthy enough. The giving is eternal, constant, complete. The kingdom is always being given. The question is never whether God is giving, but whether your consciousness is receiving, whether you are aware of, accepting of, recognizing the infinite good that is forever flowing from the source that you are. You are not a beggar petitioning a distant deity. You are consciousness itself, becoming aware of its own infinite nature, its own creative power, its own divine completeness. And when you know this, when you really know it, everything changes. The practice of non-power, true spiritual realization, comes not through mentality or willpower, but through the release of personal effort, a yielding that allows divine grace to operate through us. There is a peculiar disease that affects nearly everyone on the spiritual path, and it is this: we try too hard. We bring to our spiritual practice the same aggressive mentality we bring to every other area of life. We strain, we push, we effort, we attempt to force spiritual realization through the sheer power of our will. We believe that if we just meditate longer, affirm more intensely, visualize more vividly, concentrate more fiercely, we will finally break through to the experience we seek. But here is the profound paradox. At the heart of spiritual life, divine grace cannot be achieved through human effort. Truth cannot be grasped through mental force. The presence of God cannot be manufactured through techniques, no matter how sophisticated or sincere. In fact, all our striving, all our spiritual ambition, all our attempts to make something happen become the very obstacles that prevent the natural unfolding of spiritual awareness. This is what I call the practice of non-power, and it represents a complete reversal of everything our culture has taught us about how to succeed, how to achieve, how to get what we want. In the material world, effort produces results. Work harder and you earn more. Practice longer and you become more skilled. Apply more force and you overcome resistance. This is the law of the physical realm, and it works perfectly well for physical accomplishments. But consciousness does not operate according to the laws of matter. Spirit does not respond to human willpower. The infinite cannot be coerced by the finite, no matter how determined that finite mind might be. And so we must learn an entirely different approach. Not the way of doing, but the way of allowing, not the way of achieving, but the way of receiving, not the way of power, but the way of surrender. Look at how a flower opens. It doesn't force itself to bloom. It doesn't strain or struggle or try to make petals unfold through sheer determination. It simply allows the life within it to express itself naturally, effortlessly, in perfect timing. The intelligence that knows how to turn a seed into a flower operates not through power, but through principle, not through force, but through flow. So it is with spiritual unfoldment. There is an intelligence within, you call it Christ consciousness, Buddha nature, the Tao, the self, infinite awareness that knows exactly how to reveal itself. It knows how to heal what needs healing, provide what needs providing, illuminate what needs illuminating. But it cannot operate through the clenched fist of personal will. It requires the open hand of surrender. This doesn't mean passivity. This doesn't mean resignation or giving up or waiting helplessly for something to happen. The practice of non-power is actually an intensely active state, but it's the activity of awareness rather than the activity of willpower. It's a vigilant alertness, a receptive attention, a listening so deep that the still small voice can be heard beneath the noise of thinking. When you practice this way, you stop trying to control outcomes. You stop demanding that your prayers be answered in specific ways according to your timetable. You stop attempting to bend the universe to your will. Instead, you become still. You become open. You become available to whatever seeks to express itself through you. And here's what happens in that stillness, in that openness, in that availability. Life begins to live itself through you. Not the life you planned, not the life your ego designed, but a life infinitely more creative, more abundant, more fulfilling than anything you could have orchestrated through personal effort. Doors open that you never knew existed. Solutions appear that you never would have conceived. Grace operates in ways that transcend all human logic. This is not magic. This is not wishful thinking. This is the natural order of things when human willpower stops interfering with divine intelligence. Think about your own life. Haven't your greatest breakthroughs come not through struggle, but through surrender? Haven't your deepest insights arrived not when you were trying desperately to figure something out, but when you finally gave up and let go? Haven't your most profound healings occurred not through forcing change, but through accepting what is? The practice of non-power asks you to trust in an intelligence greater than your own. It asks you to have faith that there is a wisdom operating in your life that sees what you cannot see, knows what you cannot know, orchestrates what you could never orchestrate. It asks you to release your grip on how things should be and allow them to unfold as they will be. This is perhaps the most difficult thing for the human ego to accept. The ego wants control, it wants guarantees, it wants to be the author of its own story, the master of its own fate, the captain of its own ship. And there's nothing wrong with taking responsibility for your life, with making choices, with acting decisively when action is required. But there's a dimension of life that cannot be accessed through ego's power. There's a realm of possibility that opens only when personal will surrenders to divine will. There's a grace that flows only when the dam of human effort finally breaks and allows the river of life to move freely. The practice of non-power is learning to live in that flow. It's learning to recognize when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to be silent, when to hold on and when to let go. It's developing the spiritual sensitivity to feel the movement of truth in consciousness and align yourself with it rather than against it. This is not weakness. This is the highest form of strength, the strength to surrender, the courage to trust, the wisdom to know that you don't have to do everything yourself because there is an infinite intelligence that is already doing everything through you, as you, for you. When you practice this way, prayer becomes not a desperate reaching but a peaceful resting. Meditation becomes not a striving for experience but a simple being with what is. Life becomes not a battle to be won but a dance to be enjoyed. This is the practice of non-power, releasing everything into the hands of grace and discovering that those hands were your own all along. And so we return to where we began, to that ancient promise that has echoed through the centuries. Ask and you shall receive. But now perhaps you hear it differently, not as a formula for cosmic negotiation, but as an invitation to recognition, not as a technique for getting what you lack, but as a revelation of what you already are. The mystery we have unlocked together this morning is not complicated, though it is profound. It is simply this: there is no distance between you and your good. There is no gap between the question and the answer. There is no separation between the seeker and the sought. All of it, every bit of it, exists now, within your own consciousness, waiting only for the noise to cease so it can be known. You are not a beggar before the throne of heaven. You are consciousness itself, becoming aware of its own infinite nature. You are not praying to God, you are the presence of God, recognizing itself in this moment, in this breath, in this eternal now. So I leave you not with more things to do, but with an invitation to stop doing. Not with more techniques to master, but with permission to release all technique. Not with more prayers to recite, but with the freedom to fall silent and listen. In that silence, in that stillness, in that sacred transparency where all your effort finally exhausts itself, there you will find what you have been seeking, not as something new, but as something eternal. Not as something received, but as something recognized. Not as something given from outside, but as something emerging from the infinite depth of your own being. The kingdom is within you. It has always been within you. It will always be within you. And the greatest mystery of all is this: the moment you stop asking, you discover you already have. The moment you stop seeking, you realize you already are. The moment you become still enough to listen, you hear the answer that has been speaking all along. This is the mystery unlocked. This is the truth revealed. This is the promise fulfilled, not someday, not somewhere else, but here, now, in you. Be still and know. The familiar passage we think we know. There are certain passages of Scripture we've heard so many times that we've stopped really hearing them. We nod along, confident we've extracted the meaning, applied the lesson, and moved on. John 15:5 is one of those passages. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit, for apart from me you can do nothing. Ask most Christians what this verse means, and they'll tell you, stay connected to Jesus. They'll talk about prayer, Bible reading, church attendance, spiritual disciplines that keep you plugged in. And they're not wrong, exactly. But they're missing something profound, something that changes everything about how we understand the Christian life. The revelation most of us overlook isn't about what we need to do, it's about what we fundamentally are, and more importantly, what we aren't. It's about the nature of spiritual fruit and the shocking passivity required to produce it. It's about a way of living that seems completely backward to our achievement-oriented minds. For years, I read this passage as a motivational call to action. Work harder to stay connected, try more diligently to abide, strive to produce fruit for God's glory. But that interpretation misses the entire point of what Jesus is revealing. The vine metaphor isn't primarily about your effort, it's about your identity and position. And when you truly understand it, it will radically transform how you approach faith, spiritual growth, and your entire relationship with God. The agricultural reality, how vines actually work. To understand what Jesus is revealing, we need to understand how vines actually work. Jesus wasn't speaking in abstract theological terms to first-century disciples. He was using an image they understood intimately. Vineyards covered the hills of ancient Israel. These weren't decorative gardens, they were the agricultural backbone of the economy. Here's what every ancient listener would have immediately understood. A branch does not produce fruit through its own effort, ingenuity, or determination. A branch cannot decide to bear grapes. It cannot strategize, plan, or work harder. The branch has one function and one function only, to remain physically connected to the vine. The life is in the vine. The nutrients flow from the roots, through the trunk, into the branches. The branch receives. That's it. That's the whole job description. The branch doesn't manufacture sap, it conducts it. The branch doesn't create life, it channels life that originates elsewhere. Now here's what's radical. The fruit appears without the branch doing anything to produce it. The branch doesn't squeeze out grapes through determination. It doesn't visualize successful grape production. It doesn't attend seminars on 10 steps to better fruit bearing. The fruit simply emerges as a natural, inevitable consequence of life flowing from the vine through the branch. This is biological reality, not metaphor. If you cut a branch from the vine and prop it up with sticks, water it faithfully, position it in perfect sunlight, and encourage it with motivational speeches, you know what you'll get? A dead stick. It might look alive for a few days, it might even have some leaves that haven't wilted yet, but it will never, ever produce fruit, not a single grape, because the life source has been severed. Conversely, an ugly, twisted, seemingly unpromising branch that remains connected to a healthy vine will produce grapes, not because the branch is particularly noble or hard-working, but because life flows into it from a source beyond itself. This is the agricultural reality Jesus is leveraging, and once you see it, you can never read this passage the same way again. Because Jesus isn't saying, try really hard to be a good branch. He's saying something far more fundamental. Understand what you are and what I am. I am the source. You are the recipient. Stay in that relationship and fruit is inevitable. Leave that relationship and fruit is impossible. The identity revelation, you are not the vine. Here's the revelation most of us miss. We keep trying to be the vine. We've been trained to believe that the Christian life is about mustering up more love, generating more joy, manufacturing more patience. We think spiritual growth happens through better systems, stronger willpower, and increased effort. We approach faith like we approach fitness, a matter of discipline, consistency, and grinding it out when we don't feel like it. But Jesus makes a clear distinction. I am the vine, you are the branches. This isn't poetic fluff, this is identity definition. You are not called to be a vine. You cannot become the vine through spiritual maturity. You will never graduate to vinehood. Your position is branch, and that's not a limitation, it's your liberation. The problem is that modern Western Christianity has been deeply infected by self-help philosophy. We've turned the gospel into a divine self-improvement program. Jesus becomes a life coach, the Bible becomes a success manual, and salvation becomes the launching pad for your best life now. In this framework, you're essentially a vine, the source of your own spiritual life, who just needs Jesus to give you better techniques and stronger motivation. But that's not the gospel. That's baptized self-reliance. When Jesus says, I am the vine, he's making an exclusive claim. He alone is the source of spiritual life, not Jesus plus your effort, not Jesus plus your gifting, not Jesus plus your sincerity. Jesus, period. He is the vine, which means you definitively are not. This is simultaneously humbling and liberating. It's humbling because it strips away any claim to self-sufficiency. You cannot generate spiritual life any more than a branch can generate sap. You are fundamentally dependent, completely, utterly, continuously dependent. But here's the liberation. If you're not the vine, you're not responsible for being the vine. The pressure is off. You don't have to be the source. You don't have to figure out how to manufacture love for that difficult person. You just have to remain connected to the one who is love. You don't have to work up joy in hard circumstances. You just have to abide in the one who is joy. You don't have to produce patience through gritted teeth, you just have to stay attached to the source of all patience. The vine metaphor reveals that your position is not productivity, it's receptivity. Your calling is not to generate but to receive and transmit, and that changes everything. The productivity paradox. Fruit without striving. This brings us to perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the vine metaphor. Fruit appears without striving. In fact, striving actually prevents fruit. We need to make a crucial distinction here between fruit and works. The New Testament is clear that we're saved by grace through faith, not by works. But it's equally clear that genuine faith produces fruit. So what's the difference? Works are what you do for God. Fruit is what God does through you. Works originate in your effort, your planning, your energy. Fruit originates in Christ's life flowing through you. Works make you tired. Fruit makes you fruitful. Works can be evaluated by external metrics and human applause. Fruit is often recognized only by those with spiritual perception. Here's the productivity paradox. The more you strive to produce fruit, the less fruit you actually bear, because striving shifts your focus from abiding to achieving. And Jesus is crystal clear. Apart from me, you can do nothing, not some things, nothing, zero spiritual value. You might accomplish impressive religious activities, build large ministries, gain wide influence, but if it's not fruit of the vine, it's just wood, hay, and stubble that will burn away. Think about it agriculturally. A branch doesn't wake up anxious about grape production. It doesn't check its growth metrics or compare its grape yield to neighboring branches. It doesn't attend conferences on maximizing your fruit potential. The branch simply remains in position, receiving life from the vine, and fruit appears as a natural consequence. This is radically different from how most of us approach spiritual growth. We create elaborate systems, Bible reading plans, prayer schedules, accountability structures, ministry commitments. And these aren't bad things, but they become toxic when we unconsciously believe that these activities are what produce fruit. When we think that if we just do more, try harder, add another commitment, we'll finally become the fruitful Christians we're supposed to be. That's vine thinking, not branch thinking. Organic spiritual fruit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. These emerge from abiding. They appear when you're so saturated with Christ's presence that his character begins to express itself through you. You don't manufacture them. You don't schedule them. You don't achieve them. They happen to you as you remain in him. I've watched this play out countless times. The most fruitful Christians I know aren't the busiest ones. They're the most restful. They're not running themselves ragged for Jesus. They're sitting with Jesus, walking with Jesus, remaining conscious of Jesus throughout their day. And somehow, almost without trying, they exhibit a supernatural quality of character. Love flows through them. Peace radiates from them. Patience marks their interactions. Not because they worked up these qualities, but because they stayed connected to the source. Meanwhile, I've seen others, myself included, work themselves to exhaustion, trying to be good Christians, grinding through spiritual disciplines, white-knuckling victory over sin, forcing themselves to love and serve, and producing very little genuine fruit, lots of religious activity, lots of visible works, but not much actual fruit of the Spirit. Why? Because we were trying to be vines instead of branches. The pruning process. Growth through cutting. Jesus doesn't stop with the vine and branch metaphor. He introduces a third character. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit he takes away, and every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. Wait, he prunes the fruitful branches? That seems backward. Shouldn't he prune the unfruitful ones and leave the fruitful ones alone? But anyone familiar with viticulture knows that pruning is essential for fruit production. An unpruned vine becomes overgrown with leaves and shoots that consume energy without producing grapes. The vine dresser cuts away the excess growth, not because it's bad, but because it's distracting the plant's energy from fruit production. Here's what this means for us. God isn't just interested in you bearing fruit. He's interested in you bearing more fruit. And that requires pruning. Specifically, it requires cutting away things that aren't necessarily sinful or wrong in themselves, but are consuming life that should be directed toward fruit. This is often the most confusing season for believers. You're abiding, you're bearing fruit, life is good, and then suddenly, God starts cutting. He removes opportunities, He closes doors, He strips away activities, relationships, or roles you thought were part of your calling. And it hurts. Pruning always hurts. But here's what we miss. Pruning is evidence of fruit-bearing. If the Father is pruning you, it means you're a fruitful branch. He doesn't prune dead wood, He cuts it away entirely. Pruning is reserved for living, productive branches that He wants to make even more fruitful. What does God typically prune? Often, it's our good works, the religious activities we've accumulated, the ministry commitments that made us feel useful, the busyness that gave us identity, the accomplishments that brought approval. God cuts away the excess so that His life can flow more directly into fewer activities, producing deeper fruit. This is painful because we've often confused these works with fruit. We thought our busy ministry schedule was fruit. We thought our extensive Bible knowledge was fruit. We thought our visible leadership was fruit. But God knows the difference, and in His mercy, He prunes away the works to make room for genuine fruit. The pruning process also cuts away our false dependencies, the things we've been drawing life from, instead of from the vine, our performance, our reputation, our ministry success, our spiritual accomplishments. God cuts these away not to hurt us, but to free us, to force us back into complete dependence on Christ alone. If you're in a season of pruning right now, if life feels like it's being cut back rather than built up, take heart. You're not being punished. You're being prepared for greater fruitfulness. The Father knows what He's doing, and the temporary pain of pruning produces the permanent gain of abundant fruit. The abiding principle, remaining, not achieving. So how do we actually live as branches? Jesus gives us one instruction, repeated multiple times in John 15. Abide, remain, stay, dwell, continue. Abide in me, and I in you. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. Notice what Jesus doesn't say. He doesn't say, achieve for me. He doesn't say, produce for me. He doesn't say, accomplish for me. He says, abide in me. Abiding is fundamentally passive. It's not about doing, it's about being. It's not about achieving a state, it's about remaining in a position. The Greek word meno means to stay, to remain, to continue, to dwell. It implies settled residence, not frantic activity. Think about what it means to abide in a house. You don't achieve house dwelling through intense effort. You simply remain there. You live there. Your presence is continuous, not sporadic. You don't visit occasionally and call it abiding. Abiding is your normal state of existence. This is what Jesus is calling us to, a continuous, settled, restful awareness of and connection to Him. Not a desperate striving to maintain connection, but a peaceful remaining in connection that already exists. Here's what this looks like practically. Abiding means learning to live with a background consciousness of Christ's presence. It's the habit of turning your thoughts toward Him throughout the day, not in some hyper-spiritual way, but as naturally as you'd be aware of a close friend walking beside you. Abiding means resisting the compulsion to fix everything yourself. When problems arise, the abiding branch's first instinct isn't to spring into action, but to remain connected, drawing wisdom and direction from the vine. Abiding means learning to distinguish between the Spirit's prompting and your own striving. The Spirit produces fruit, your flesh produces works. The Spirit's leading is usually quiet, clear, and peaceful. Your flesh's urgency is usually loud, anxious, and exhausting. Abiding means being okay with seasons of stillness. Western Christianity is deeply uncomfortable with stillness. We equate spiritual health with constant activity. But some of the most fruitful seasons in a believer's life are the quiet ones, when nothing visible is happening but everything essential is occurring beneath the surface. Abiding also means accepting your dependence. This is perhaps the hardest part for those of us raised in cultures that celebrate independence. We don't want to need anyone, even God. We want to be strong, capable, self-sufficient. But the vine metaphor demolishes self-sufficiency. You need the vine every moment of every day. Your next breath of spiritual life comes from Him. Your next moment of genuine love flows from Him. Your next ounce of real patience is supplied by Him. And here's the beautiful paradox. When you stop trying to be strong and admit your weakness, His strength is perfected in you. When you stop trying to produce and simply remain connected, fruit appears. The less you rely on yourself, the more He expresses Himself through you. The warning: apart from Him, nothing. Jesus doesn't leave this as a gentle metaphor. He makes it stark. Apart from me, you can do nothing. Nothing. Not some things. Not a little bit. Nothing of eternal value, nothing that counts as spiritual fruit, nothing that survives God's scrutiny. Apart from Christ, you might do many things, impressive things, even religious things, but they amount to nothing in the kingdom of God. This is a sobering reality that cuts through our illusions about spiritual productivity. How much of what we call ministry is actually just religious activity disconnected from the life of the vine? How much of what we count as spiritual growth is just self-improvement with a Christian vocabulary? The test of genuine fruit is simple. Does it require Christ's life to exist, or could you produce it through natural talent, personality, or effort? Could an unbeliever do what you're doing with the same level of effectiveness? If so, you might be producing works, not fruit. This is why Jesus emphasizes both sides of the abiding relationship. Abide in me, and I in you. It's not enough for you to make some external connection to Christian community or practice. Christ Himself must abide in you, His life, His Spirit, His presence actively dwelling within and flowing through. The warning intensifies. If anyone does not abide in me, he is thrown away like a branch and withers, and the branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. This isn't primarily about salvation, it's about usefulness and fruitfulness. A branch separated from the vine becomes firewood. It has no other purpose, no other value. How many believers are living as disconnected branches, going through the motions of Christianity while drawing life from other sources? Their career, success, their family, their ministry, reputation, their theological knowledge. These things aren't evil in themselves, but when they become your source instead of Christ, you're severed. You might maintain the appearance of life for a while, but you're not bearing fruit. You're withering. The question we must ask ourselves constantly: what am I actually drawing life from? When I'm discouraged, where do I turn for encouragement? When I'm weak, what do I depend on for strength? When I'm empty, what do I expect to fill me? If the honest answer is anything other than Christ, we've disconnected from the vine. Application: living as branches in a performance-driven world. So, how do we actually live this out in a culture, and often a church culture, that's obsessed with performance, metrics, and visible achievement? First, we must release the pressure to produce. This doesn't mean becoming passive or lazy. It means recognizing that fruit is God's responsibility, not yours. Your responsibility is abiding. His responsibility is fruit-bearing. You cannot do His part, and He won't do yours. This means, practically, stop comparing your fruitfulness to others. Stop anxiously checking for visible results. Stop evaluating your spiritual health by how much you accomplish. The branch doesn't evaluate itself by its grape production. The vine dresser does that. Your job is simply to remain connected. Second, we must shift from doing to being. Christianity is ultimately about identity and relationship, not activity and achievement. Before God calls you to do anything, He establishes who you are, His beloved child, a branch in the true vine. Your doing flows from your being, not the other way around. This means prioritize time simply being with God, over time doing things for God. Cultivate the habit of God's presence throughout your day. Learn to hear His voice in the ordinary moments. Let your service emerge from overflow, not obligation. Third, we must practice what we might call strategic subtraction. If God is pruning, cooperate with Him. What needs to be cut away from your life? What good activities are consuming life that should be directed toward fruit? What ministry commitments have become works instead of fruit? This requires courage because our culture and our flesh equates subtraction with failure. But the vine dresser knows that strategic cutting produces greater abundance. Less can truly be more when it means more life flowing into fewer outlets. Fourth, we must learn to recognize genuine fruit versus manufactured works. Ask yourself, does this love I'm showing flow naturally from abiding, or am I forcing myself to act loving? Does this joy emerge from God's presence, or am I faking happiness? Is this patience a supernatural gift, or am I gritting my teeth? Genuine fruit has a quality of ease, not because it's effortless, but because it's spirit-energized. You're cooperating with divine life rather than generating human effort. You know the difference in how it feels. Fruit brings rest even in difficulty. Works bring exhaustion even in success. Finally, we must embrace the rhythm of abiding. This isn't about adding another spiritual discipline to your overloaded schedule. It's about cultivating moment-by-moment awareness of Christ's presence and dependence on His life. Some practical ways to cultivate abiding. Start your day acknowledging your complete dependence on Christ for everything. Throughout the day, practice breath prayers, short, simple prayers that keep you consciously connected. When facing decisions or difficulties, pause and seek His wisdom before acting. End your day reviewing where you sensed His presence and where you operated in your own strength. The goal isn't perfection in abiding, it's direction toward abiding. You'll forget, you'll drift, you'll try to be the vine instead of the branch. But each time you recognize it, simply return to your position. Reconnect. Remain. The overlooked revelation. So, here's the revelation most of us overlook in John 15. The Christian life is not about trying harder, it's about remaining closer. It's not about producing more, it's about receiving more. It's not about being a better vine, it's about being a more dependent branch. Jesus didn't say, I am the vine, you are junior vines in training. He said, I am the vine, you are the branches. That distinction is everything. Your calling isn't to manufacture spiritual life, it's to remain connected to the source of spiritual life and let Him express His life through you. This is radically countercultural, even in Christian circles. Everything in our achievement-oriented world tells us that success requires grinding, striving, and working harder. But the vine metaphor reveals a different path, the path of abiding, receiving, and resting in your position. When you truly embrace your identity as a branch, when you stop trying to be the vine and simply remain connected to the vine, something supernatural happens. Fruit appears. Not the forced, manufactured fruit of religious striving, but the organic, authentic fruit of divine life flowing through you. Love becomes natural, joy becomes your baseline, peace guards your heart, patience marks your interactions, kindness flows from you, goodness characterizes you, faithfulness defines you, gentleness softens you, self-control empowers you. Not because you worked up these qualities through determination, but because you remained connected to the one who is all these things. That's the overlooked revelation of I am the vine. It's not a call to do more. It's an invitation to rest more deeply in who he is and who you are in him. The question isn't, what can I do for God today? The question is, am I abiding in him today? Answer that second question rightly, and the first question answers itself. Because the branch that abides in the vine bears much fruit, not through striving, but through remaining. Apart from him, you can do nothing, but in him, connected to him, depending on him moment by moment, you bear fruit that remains, fruit that glorifies the Father, fruit that reveals the reality of Christ's life in you. That's not religious obligation, that's organic inevitability. That's the life of the branch that knows its source. So stop trying to be the vine, embrace your identity as the branch, abide, remain, rest in your position, and watch what he produces through you.
Joel Goldsmith stood in his church pew one Sunday morning in 1928, listening to familiar hymns and traditional sermons, when suddenly a profound realization struck him like lightning. The God he was worshiping in that building was not the God he was beginning to experience in his deepest moments of silence. This discovery would shake the very foundation of everything he believed about spirituality, religion, and the nature of divine healing. Joel realized that the God of his church experience was a God outside himself, a God he had to petition, beg, and convince to act on his behalf. But in those sacred moments of inner stillness, Joel was discovering something revolutionary. He was experiencing God not as a distant deity, but as the very essence of his own being. This was not the God of organized religion, but the God of direct spiritual experience and immediate presence. The young Joel knew in that moment that his spiritual journey would take a completely different path. He would have to abandon everything he was taught about God, prayer, and healing to embrace this profound truth that was emerging from within his own consciousness. The traditional church had taught Joel to pray to God for things he needed. Pray for healing when sick. Pray for prosperity when lacking. Pray for guidance when confused. But this approach suddenly felt completely backwards to him, like he was addressing someone who was absent from his experience. In his moments of deep meditation and contemplation, Joel began to realize that God was not someone to pray to, but rather the very consciousness with which he was praying. This was not a theological concept, but a living, breathing reality he could feel in the depths of his being. This discovery changed everything about how Joel understood prayer itself. Instead of petitioning an external deity, he began to rest in the awareness that God was the very life, the very consciousness, the very presence that he was. Prayer became recognition rather than supplication. Joel understood that he was not a human being trying to reach God, but rather God expressing as individual consciousness. This was the secret that would transform not only his own life, but eventually touch thousands of seekers around the world who were hungry for authentic spiritual experience. The church had taught Joel that he was a sinner, separated from God, needing salvation through external means. But in his direct spiritual experiences, Joel discovered something that contradicted this fundamental teaching. He realized that separation from God was impossible because God was his very existence. Joel began to understand that what the church called sin was simply a misunderstanding of his true nature. When he rested in the awareness of his oneness with divine consciousness, problems that seemed overwhelming would dissolve naturally, without struggle or external intervention. This was not positive thinking or mental manipulation, but a profound recognition of spiritual truth. Joel discovered that when he ceased trying to change conditions and instead recognized the divine nature of his being, healing happened spontaneously, and relationships transformed effortlessly. The young mystic realized he was standing at the threshold of a completely new understanding of spirituality. Everything the church had taught him about his relationship with God would have to be abandoned in favor of this direct, immediate experience of divine oneness. Joel's breakthrough came when he stopped asking God for things and started recognizing God as the source of his very ability to be aware. This was not a philosophical concept, but a living realization that changed his entire experience of life. He discovered that God was not absent, waiting to be contacted, but present as his very consciousness. This recognition brought immediate peace to Joel's restless seeking. Instead of trying to get something from God, he began to rest in the awareness that God was already expressing as his life, his health, his intelligence, and his love. This was the secret that traditional religion had missed completely. Joel understood that most people spend their entire lives trying to reach God through rituals, prayers, and religious practices, never realizing that God is the very awareness with which they are seeking. This divine consciousness is not hidden in some distant heaven, but present right here, right now. This discovery would become the foundation of Joel's entire teaching ministry. He would spend the rest of his life helping others recognize this same truth about their spiritual nature, freeing them from the limitations of traditional religious concepts about God and prayer. Within months of this profound realization, Joel began experiencing what he could only call miracles. A woman with chronic arthritis visited him, and instead of praying for her healing, Joel simply rested in the awareness that God was her true being. She left his office completely free of pain after 20 years of suffering. This was not the result of pleading with God or using special religious formulas. Joel had simply recognized the divine nature of her being, and this recognition dissolved the illusion of separation that was appearing as physical limitation. The healing was instantaneous because God's wholeness was already present. A businessman came to Joel in financial crisis, facing bankruptcy and despair. Joel did not pray for money or success, but instead held the truth that divine substance was this man's real nature. Within weeks, unexpected opportunities appeared, and the financial situation completely transformed. Joel began to understand that these were not miracles in the traditional sense, but natural outcomes of recognizing spiritual truth. When the divine nature of being is acknowledged, the limitations that seemed so real simply dissolve because they were never actually real in the first place. The most remarkable healing that convinced Joel of this new path involved his own daughter. She had been diagnosed with a serious condition that doctors said would require extensive medical intervention. Joel faced the ultimate test of his newfound understanding about the nature of God and healing. Instead of turning to traditional prayer or medical procedures, Joel spent hours in deep contemplation, recognizing his daughter's true spiritual identity. He did not try to heal her condition, but simply rested in the awareness that God was her actual being, perfect and whole. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Over the course of several weeks, every symptom disappeared completely. The doctors were baffled, finding no medical explanation for her complete recovery. Joel knew this was the confirmation he needed about the truth he had discovered. This experience sealed Joel's commitment to abandon traditional religious approaches to God and healing. He realized that most people are trying to get God to do something, when the truth is that God is already being everything perfectly. Recognition of this truth is the key to all transformation. Word began to spread about Joel's unusual approach to spiritual healing. People traveled from distant cities to experience what he was offering. Unlike traditional religious healers, Joel never claimed to heal anyone or to have special powers. He simply recognized the divine nature of those who came to him. A mother brought her son who had been mute since birth. The doctors had given no hope for normal speech development. Joel spent time in silent recognition that God was this child's true identity, complete and perfect. He did not ask for healing, but simply acknowledged what was already true spiritually. After several sessions of this recognition work, the child began to speak clearly and naturally. The transformation was not gradual, but sudden and complete. The mother wept as she heard her son's voice for the first time, knowing she had witnessed something beyond ordinary human understanding. Joel realized that these healings were teaching him something profound about the nature of reality itself. When divine consciousness is recognized as the truth of any situation, the material appearances that contradict this truth naturally disappear, because they have no real foundation. The most profound case that established Joel's reputation involved a man who had been blind for over a decade. Traditional prayers, medical treatments, and religious interventions had all failed. The man came to Joel as a last resort, expecting nothing but hoping for some small improvement in his condition. Joel did not pray for the man's sight to be restored. Instead, he spent time recognizing that divine consciousness was this man's true identity, and that spiritual vision was his natural state. This was not visualization or positive thinking, but recognition of what was already true from God's perspective. The transformation happened during their third session together. The man suddenly began to see light, then shapes, then full clear vision returned completely. Medical examinations could find no explanation for the restoration of sight that doctors had declared permanently lost. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Joel's discovery led him to develop what he called the practice of recognition rather than petition. This meant that instead of asking God for things, he would recognize what God was already being in any situation. This was not a mental technique, but a spiritual discipline of seeing from God's perspective. When faced with any problem or challenge, Joel would become very still and recognize that divine consciousness was the only real presence in that situation. He discovered that this recognition had the power to dissolve even the most challenging circumstances without any human effort or struggle. This practice required Joel to abandon all his previous ideas about how prayer was supposed to work. Instead of talking to God, he learned to be still and let God's perspective reveal itself. This stillness was not empty, but full of divine knowing and presence. Joel found that the more he practiced this recognition, the more natural it became. Problems that used to create anxiety and stress would simply dissolve when met with this understanding. He was learning to live from God's perspective rather than human limitation. The second technique Joel discovered was what he called impersonal love. This meant recognizing that the love of God was not personal to him, but was flowing through him to bless everyone in his experience. This understanding transformed his relationships and his ability to help others. Joel realized that when he tried to love people personally, with his human emotions and preferences, that love was limited and conditional. But when he recognized divine love flowing through him, that love was unlimited, unconditional, and had the power to transform anyone who received it. This impersonal love became the foundation of Joel's healing work. He did not love people personally, but allowed divine love to express through him toward everyone. This love carried with it the recognition of their spiritual perfection, which is what created the healing transformations. Joel discovered that this approach freed him from the emotional drain that often comes with trying to help others. Divine love never gets depleted because it flows from an infinite source. He became a clear channel for God's love rather than trying to love from his personal resources. Joel's third major discovery was the practice of spiritual discernment. This meant learning to distinguish between appearances and spiritual reality. He realized that most human problems are based on accepting material appearances as the final truth about any situation. When someone came to Joel with a problem, he would not focus on the problem itself, but would discern the spiritual reality behind the appearance. If someone appeared sick, Joel would discern their spiritual wholeness. If someone appeared lacking, Joel would discern divine abundance as their true nature. This discernment was not denial of what appeared to be happening, but recognition of what was true from God's perspective. Joel learned that spiritual reality is more fundamental than material appearance, and when spiritual truth is recognized, material appearances conform to that truth. This practice required Joel to develop what he called spiritual vision, the ability to see beyond the evidence of the physical senses to the underlying spiritual facts. This vision became stronger the more he practiced it, until it became his natural way of perceiving life. Joel's fourth discovery was the power of conscious stillness. He learned that in moments of complete inner quiet, divine consciousness would reveal solutions, healing, and guidance that the human mind could never figure out. This stillness became his most powerful spiritual tool. This was not ordinary meditation or relaxation, but a specific kind of stillness where Joel would become completely receptive to divine consciousness. In this stillness, he would often receive direct spiritual insights that would transform whatever situation he was addressing. Joel discovered that most people live in constant mental activity, trying to solve their problems through thinking and planning. But in conscious stillness, divine intelligence would reveal solutions that were more perfect than anything the human mind could devise. This practice of conscious stillness became central to all of Joel's work. Whether he was helping someone with healing, relationship problems, or financial challenges, he would always begin by becoming still and letting divine consciousness reveal the spiritual truth of the situation. As Joel developed his new understanding, he encountered significant resistance from traditional religious communities. Church leaders criticized his teachings as dangerous departures from established doctrine. They accused him of minimizing the role of Jesus and undermining the authority of Scripture. Joel faced a difficult choice. He could return to conventional religious teaching and maintain acceptance within traditional circles, or he could continue following this inner guidance, even though it meant spiritual isolation from his religious background. The criticism was particularly painful because it came from people Joel respected and loved. Fellow ministers questioned his spiritual authority and suggested that his experiences might be coming from questionable sources rather than genuine divine revelation. But Joel had experienced too much genuine transformation to doubt what he had discovered. The healings, the peace, and the practical spiritual solutions were undeniable evidence that he was on the right path, even if that path was different from traditional religious approaches. Joel's biggest challenge came when he began to doubt his own experiences during a particularly difficult period. For several months, the recognition practices that had worked so powerfully seemed to have no effect. People came for help and left unchanged. Joel wondered if he had been deceiving himself. This dark period taught Joel an important lesson about spiritual development. He learned that consciousness goes through cycles of expansion and contraction, and that apparent failures are often preparation for deeper understanding. He had to learn not to judge his spiritual progress by external results. During this challenging time, Joel deepened his practice of conscious stillness and recognition. Instead of being discouraged by apparent lack of results, he used this time to deepen his understanding of the principles he had discovered. He learned to trust the process even when results were not immediate. Joel emerged from this period with greater spiritual maturity and understanding. He realized that authentic spiritual development requires patience and persistence. The techniques he had discovered were not magic formulas, but required ongoing development of consciousness and deepening of understanding. Another significant obstacle Joel faced was the tendency to make his spiritual insights into rigid rules or methods. He discovered that the moment he tried to turn his understanding into a system or technique, it lost its power and became just another form of mental manipulation. Joel learned that spiritual truth must remain alive and fresh in each moment. The recognition of God's presence could not become a formula to be repeated, but had to be a genuine realization that emerged from authentic spiritual insight in each new situation. This taught Joel the importance of staying connected to the source of his understanding rather than relying on past insights or experiences. Each moment required fresh recognition, fresh stillness, and fresh receptivity to divine consciousness. Joel discovered that true spiritual teaching could not be reduced to methods or techniques, but required the transmission of consciousness itself. He learned to teach not just with words, but with the quality of awareness and presence that he had developed through his own spiritual practice. The most persistent challenge Joel encountered was helping people understand that they didn't need to do anything to earn God's love or healing. Most people came to him expecting to learn new spiritual practices or techniques that would make them worthy of divine blessing. Joel had to teach people that their true spiritual identity was already perfect and complete. The healing they were seeking was not something they had to achieve, but something they had to recognize was already present. This was often difficult for people to accept. Many people preferred the idea that they could do something spiritual to fix their problems. The concept that they were already whole and perfect and needed only to recognize this truth seemed too simple to be effective. They wanted more complicated spiritual practices and disciplines. Joel learned to be patient with this resistance, understanding that it takes time for consciousness to accept such a radical departure from conventional spiritual thinking. He developed ways to help people gradually open to this understanding without overwhelming them with concepts that were too foreign. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? As Joel's understanding matured, he began integrating these principles into every aspect of daily life. He discovered that the recognition of God's presence was not just for healing sessions or spiritual emergencies, but could transform ordinary activities like business meetings, family relationships, and personal decisions. Joel learned to begin each day by recognizing that divine consciousness was the source and substance of everything he would experience. This recognition would carry through his interactions with people, his work responsibilities, and even simple activities like eating meals or taking walks. This integration required Joel to develop what he called practicing the presence. This meant maintaining awareness of God's immediate presence throughout the day, not just during formal spiritual practices. Every moment became an opportunity for recognition and spiritual awareness. Joel discovered that when life is lived from this perspective, even challenging situations become opportunities for deeper spiritual understanding. Problems became invitations to recognize God's presence more clearly, rather than obstacles to overcome through human effort. Joel's approach to relationships was completely transformed by his discovery. Instead of trying to change or improve people, he learned to recognize their spiritual perfection. This recognition often brought out the best in others without any direct communication about their problems or limitations. In his marriage, Joel stopped trying to be a better husband through personal effort, and instead recognized divine love expressing through him toward his wife. This shift created a harmony and intimacy that personal trying had never achieved. With his children, Joel learned to see beyond their behavioral challenges to their spiritual perfection. This recognition helped them develop confidence and spiritual understanding that no amount of parental advice or discipline could have created. Joel's professional relationships were transformed when he began recognizing divine intelligence operating through everyone in his business dealings. This recognition often led to creative solutions and harmonious outcomes that benefited everyone involved. Financial challenges provided Joel with opportunities to apply his spiritual understanding in practical ways. Instead of worrying about money or trying to manipulate circumstances to increase income, Joel learned to recognize divine substance as the source of all supply. This recognition did not mean ignoring practical financial responsibilities, but it meant approaching money matters from spiritual understanding rather than fear or anxiety. Joel discovered that when divine substance was recognized, practical solutions and opportunities would appear naturally. Joel's business affairs became expressions of his spiritual understanding rather than separate secular activities. He found that conducting business from recognition of divine intelligence and integrity created success that was both financially rewarding and spiritually satisfying. This integration taught Joel that there is no separation between spiritual life and practical life. Every aspect of human experience can be transformed when approached from recognition of divine consciousness as the source and substance of all activity. Health challenges continued to be opportunities for Joel to deepen his understanding of spiritual healing. When he experienced physical symptoms, he would apply the same principles he used when helping others, recognizing his own spiritual wholeness and perfection. Joel learned that healing consciousness must be impersonal, even when applied to oneself. He could not heal his own problems through personal will or desire, but only through recognition of divine consciousness as his true being and the source of all wholeness. This self-application of spiritual principles taught Joel important lessons about the nature of consciousness and identity. He discovered that the same divine consciousness that healed others was his own true nature, not something separate from him that he had to access. Joel's personal healing experiences became testimonies to the consistency of spiritual law. The principles that worked for others worked for him in exactly the same way, confirming that these were universal spiritual truths rather than personal abilities or gifts. After years of developing and practicing these principles, Joel began to see the broader implications of what he had discovered. He realized that his understanding was not just about personal healing or individual spiritual development, but about the transformation of human consciousness itself. Joel understood that the separation between God and humanity that traditional religion taught was the root cause of all human suffering. When this illusion of separation is dissolved through recognition of divine consciousness as individual being, all forms of limitation naturally disappear, This understanding gave Joel a sense of mission that extended far beyond his individual practice. He felt called to share this discovery with anyone who was ready to receive it, knowing that it had the potential to transform not just individuals, but entire communities and eventually all of human civilization. Joel began to envision a world where people lived from this understanding of their divine nature. He saw that when enough individuals recognized God as their true being, the collective human experience would be transformed into an expression of heaven on earth. Joel's teaching ministry became his way of sharing this revolutionary understanding with the world. He began traveling internationally, speaking to audiences who were hungry for authentic spiritual experience beyond traditional religious concepts. Unlike conventional religious teachers, Joel did not ask people to believe anything or adopt new religious practices. Instead, he invited them to discover for themselves the divine consciousness that was already their true nature. He taught through recognition rather than instruction. Joel's students began experiencing the same kinds of transformations that had convinced him to abandon traditional religious concepts. Healings occurred regularly in his lectures and classes, not because Joel was performing miracles, but because people were recognizing their own spiritual wholeness. This teaching work confirmed for Joel that his discovery was not personal revelation, but universal spiritual truth that anyone could experience. The principles he had discovered worked consistently for anyone who was willing to abandon limited concepts about God and embrace direct spiritual experience. As Joel's influence spread around the world, he remained humble about his role in sharing these teachings. He consistently emphasized that he was not the source of healing or transformation, but simply someone who had learned to recognize divine consciousness as the only real presence and power. Joel's later years were marked by deepening peace and spiritual maturity. The revolutionary discovery that had once seemed so radical had become the natural foundation of his entire life experience. Living from God consciousness had become as natural as breathing. The students who learned from Joel began teaching others, creating a worldwide community of people who had abandoned traditional religious concepts in favor of direct spiritual experience. Joel's discovery was spreading and transforming lives on every continent. Joel never claimed to have founded a new religion or spiritual movement. He simply shared what he had discovered about the immediate availability of God consciousness to anyone willing to look beyond traditional religious concepts to direct spiritual experience. Joel Goldsmith's life became a testament to the transformational power of recognizing God as immediate presence rather than distant deity. His discovery that God is individual consciousness rather than external ruler changed not only his own life, but thousands of lives around the world. The young man who had once sat in church pews listening to traditional sermons had become a pioneer of mystical Christianity, showing others how to experience God directly, rather than through religious intermediaries. His legacy continues to inspire seekers of authentic spiritual experience. Joel's greatest gift to humanity was demonstrating that the kingdom of heaven is not a future destination, but a present reality available to anyone willing to recognize God as their own true being. This recognition transforms every aspect of human experience from limitation to freedom. Today, decades after Joel's transition, his teachings continue to guide people into the direct experience of God consciousness that he discovered when he abandoned everything his church had taught him about the nature of divine reality. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path.